Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, welcome back. Before I introduce Donald, it's our custom to go around and introduce ourselves to each other. I'm Martin Snow. Doug Hall.
Darren, Justin, Carl Wolf, Peter,
Luke.
Donald,
Bill.
Lee,
Don.
George,
Aaron.
Dave, Martin,
Paul.
Daniel, Lee, Patrick, Rule,
Clint,
Robert.
Ray Dyer,
David,
Norman.
Bill Childs,
Leor,
Jack, Chris, Ed,
Peter. Mark.
Kurt,
Michael.
William Monty,
Rich Sarna. Tom Thurston.
Bob Silokan,
Todd Pope,
Brian, Kay,
Mike,
Hunter.
Michael,
Gary.
Howard, Stephen,
Steve, David.
Is everyone, anyone here for the first time or returned after a long absence?
I've been here 2 years.
Could you introduce yourself one more time?
Oh, I'm Ed Levin.
Okay.
And Mark's in visiting.
Oh, great. Welcome, and all the longtime members will be happy to share sometime with you in the outer room after our speaker. Okay, but our speaker today, let me introduce him. Donald Rothberg has practiced insight and metta meditation since 1976. He is a longtime organizer and teacher for the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and he is the guiding teacher for a new spirit rock program, The Path of Engagement. Donald also teaches socially engaged spirituality, Buddhism, and transpersonal psychology at Saybrook Graduate School, and is the author of a book, The Engaged Spiritual Life, a Buddhist approach to transforming ourselves and the world. You can listen to Donald at www.audiodharma.org, which, by the way, I checked out, and is an excellent website. I recommend it to everyone.
What is it again?
Audiodharma.org.
Also at Dharma Seed.
Well, also at Dharma Seed. Okay. This Sunday's topic is connecting inner and outer transformation in a time of crisis. With that,
Thank you very much. I'm just noticing the Buddha back here. He didn't say his name, did he? I'm happy everyone's here. Navigated the change in time. I actually got really fooled this morning because the little watch, that I keep in my pocket. I woke up and I thought I had an extra hour, and it actually was really sneaky and changed the time. Electronically, these things are really getting programmed these days. So I'm had to run quickly to make Barton be here. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to see a lot of old friends. Not meaning old chronologically, but people I've met before, and some new friends. And I do want to talk as I really was suggested by Dean Bellerby, who was working with the scheduling. He suggested really focusing on the quality of engaged practice and its connection with Buddhist practice. That's what I want to focus on that connection of inner and outer transformation. And I thought I'd start with a reading from a very short text that some of you may have seen that came out the last few months from Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's an American-born Buddhist monk. It came out in the journal Buddha Dharma. And it's entitled A Challenge to Buddhists. And if you don't know Bhikkhu Bodhi, he's the translator. It's probably the premier English language translator of Buddhist text in this generation. He's a monk. He's the translator of the Wisdom publication series on the Discourses of the Buddha, those heavy books that you probably have looked at, and perhaps some of you have in your own library. And in many ways, he's been a voice of orthodoxy. When you read his translations, he gives very clear analyses of the basic Buddhist doctrines, and particularly in Theravada Buddhism. You'll hear very deep and wonderful discourses on the stages of awakening, on the stages of absorption, the jhanas, the very traditional teachings. And so it was very interesting that just a few months ago this came out, and and it shows this picture of him. He looks kind of like a frail, somewhat frail, reclusive, scholarly monk type. But this is what he says. Each morning I check out a number of internet news reports and commentaries on websites ranging from the BBC to Truthout. Reading about current issues strongly reinforces for me the acuity of the Buddha's words, the world is grounded upon suffering. Almost daily I am awed by the enormity of the suffering that assails human beings on every continent. He goes on to say, it seems to me that we Western Buddhists tend to dwell in a cognitive space that defines the First Noble Truth largely against the background of our middle-class lifestyles, as the gnawing of discontent, the ennui of oversatiation, the pain of unfulfilling relationships, or with a bow to Buddhist theory, as a bondage to the round of rebirths. Too often I feel our focus on these aspects of dukkha has made us oblivious to the vast catastrophic suffering that daily overwhelms 3/4 of the world's population. He goes on to say, I know that we engage in lofty meditations on kindness and compassion and espouse beautiful ideals of love and peace. But note that we pursue them largely as inward subjective experiences geared towards personal transformation. Too seldom does this type of compassion roll up its sleeves and step into the field. Too rarely does it translate into pragmatic programs of effective action realistically designed to diminish the actual sufferings of those battered by natural calamities or societal deprivation. And then he goes on to say that we have to give attention to the institutional forms of suffering, not just to the, as it were, personal manifestations as we find them in our own being. He says, to help free beings from suffering today, therefore requires that we counter the systemic embodiments of greed, hatred, and delusion, not just their embodiments in our person. And so it's, for many of us who knew Bhikkhu Bodhi, this was interesting, the power of the internet to shift Bhikkhu Bodhi. But it's a very strong statement, and I want to really follow up in different ways, because I personally believe that the world really needs that connection of inner and outer transformation. And of course, many of you are already making that connection, I'm sure, in different ways, whether it's in connecting your inner practice with your work in the world, or your service, or your being involved in social action. But I would claim that the world is really longing for kind of a new synthesis of inner and outer transformation. I'd also say, make a few further claims, and then I want to talk more about what that inner and outer connection looks like. First of all, that social service or social action without a spiritual dimension runs a lot of risks. And I think many of us maybe are here because we know that without the spiritual dimension, if we're just involved in social service or social action, we run the risk of not really seeing deeply the roots of suffering or the roots of violence or the roots of oppression. That we tend to look more superficially. We don't necessarily look to the deep psychological and sort of existential dimensions of suffering. People engaged in social service without a spiritual practice also, I think, run the risk of burnout, of not having some of the resources of mindfulness and compassion and equanimity and renewal that come from spiritual practice. Probably more relevant for us, it's also, I believe, the case that spiritual practice without that connection to the social dimensions of our life also runs a lot of risks. I think they're parallel in a way. That spiritual practice without that kind of engagement does run the risk of being escapist. It does run the risk of being privileged, really, if I can say that. Of being in a, but much as Bhikkhu Bodhi said, being in a privileged space where we cultivate, as it were, our own garden. And that, I think there are definitely times when that's really appropriate. There are cycles of moving in inner and outer, but if in the long run we don't make that connection with the social dimension, we do run that risk. I think we also run the risk of having our lives be fragmented, of having peace here, and what about that part of my life? My life as a citizen, or my life in relation to the world or the larger community, and we can be quite fragmented and just, okay, here I'm spiritual, and here forget it, or it's hopeless, or whatever. And also I think that very much relates to, we run the risk of not dealing with certain parts of ourselves that are either socially conditioned or very much part of how we relate to the larger world. And by saying that, I don't mean to say that we all should be on the front lines all the time. That there are actually many ways of making this connection, and I'm actually quite inspired by something I learned from Joanna Macy, who has a very simple but beautiful sense of what she calls the components of what she calls the great turning. We could call it the transformative impulse as it manifests, particularly socially. And she's talking about the great turning basically towards a sustainable, more peaceful world, which we obviously need, or we won't have Dharma groups in 100 years. We need that very much. And she says that to make this turning, there are three major dimensions, and we need all three of them, and each of us might find our gifts and our ways of making a connection in different ways. And I think that's really, really crucial. She says the first aspect of the great turning is the commitment to what she calls holding actions to prevent further damage. That is, to prevent further damage, whether it's politically, socially, materially. And that's where traditional protest typically comes in. It's trying to prevent negative things from continuing, trying to stop wars, it's trying to protest against something that's happening and so forth. And that's an important piece of the turning. But she says there are two other major areas where I think we might be really bringing much of our action if we want to make that connection at the inner and outer. And the second is what she calls creating alternative institutions. It's analyzing the nature of our core institutions, whether they're medical, educational, political, economic, ecological, or whatever, and seeing how they work, and then being engaged in developing new ways of doing things. And I think in many ways, just to be here is doing that. It's creating different kinds of spiritual institutions that meet people's needs. But it also would mean that if I'm connected with alternative schools or different ways of working with medical care, I'm sure as many of you are doing, that would be part of this great turning. That's a form of engagement. And the third form of this great turning is, she says, shifting the very way that we perceive the world, knowing that those inner perceptions are deeply connected with the institutions and the way the world is. And so that might be to, teach yoga, or to work to be a meditation teacher, and to shift people's very views of who they are, how they relate to their experience. If one's a yoga teacher, it might be to shift towards a very different attitude towards human bodies, and really be able to shift there. And what's important, I think, is that we each find our place where we're engaged. And also, this is really crucial, that we know that these different dimensions are connected. That too often we think, oh, I'm teaching yoga, I'm not connected with the person who's trying to, pass a bill in the California legislature to eliminate certain products that are harmful. That we tend not to see that connection, but I think that this model really helps to know that we are connected, and yet we have to find the place where we see our gifts being manifested. So the last thing I'll say about that need to have this inner and outer connection is that it's hard. And I'll talk the rest of the time about that. and then also come back to this handout and suggest some ways of working to see our spiritual practice as connecting inner and outer. And then I want to leave a fair amount of time for discussion. I'll try not to be distracted by this watch clock in front of me which says 12:17. So for me, making this connection has really been hard in my own life, and maybe because I've been trying to make it for a long time, and I think now there's a certain level of people saying, yes, we need to make those connections. But when I was first, I came of age in the late 60s and early 70s and was an activist and very involved in kind of late Vietnam era type movements and activities and learning. But I was also very aware at that time that a lot of the activists seemed to be extremely self-righteous. They were very... they often demonized not just the government, but also anyone who disagreed with them. And I often asked the question, do I want to be in this person's revolution? And you may have had that same question at different times. But it really raised the question of how of what the vision is, and whether the secular left really had a vision that was full and something I could really connect with. And I basically came to the conclusion that there were a lot of insights, but that there were a lot of things lacking as well. So I found myself not quite feeling so comfortable there. In the middle 70s, I found Buddhist practice and felt a deep connection and longing, and I started to get involved with that. And I never really gave up the activism, but I was very interested in what I was learning, and I would come to my social justice buddies and tell them about how important this meditation is. And I was also starting to make connections with the work of people like Gandhi and King, who had brought these together in previous generations. And for the most part, my friends who were into social justice thought I was losing it. And maybe I was losing something. But they really thought that I was being escapist and there was some problem, and they did all sorts of things, like try to get me drunk, and so I'd really reveal things and so forth. Anyway, but it was actually a difficult experience, because there were some friendships lost, and people really were. Most of the people I knew from my activist times really couldn't make that connection. And as I got deeper into Buddhist meditation, I didn't leave behind the others. And I wanted to bring up issues like, okay, in our community, how do we deal with issues of power and authority? People didn't seem too interested in that in the Buddhist community, and especially in the tradition I worked with. I know it's different in different traditions, but in the insight meditation or Vipassana approach, it was very oriented towards retreats. We didn't even in the early years, we didn't even have local sitting groups very much. And it was very oriented toward retreats. And I would find it very hard to bring up any social, political issues. And I would also, in a way, feel lonely. There was a way that I was yearning for something that I couldn't find in either group, but I wanted to bring them together. And this went on for quite a while, that inability to make the connections. And at that time I was living at first on the East Coast, and then I spent 7 years in Kentucky and rural Ohio. And I have to say, the only way I really resolved that problem of connecting inner and outer was by moving to California. And then everything fell into place, so to say. Somewhat. But it actually, when I came here, I did find a critical mass of people who really were interested in bringing the two together. When I came here right at the end of the 80s and connected with Buddhist Peace Fellowship, which I found for the first time a kind of a home where that bridge was really the primary agenda. And I started going to meetings in Asia of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which was just an amazing experience to meet people primarily from the Asian countries, but also from Europe and North America and Australia, who were interested in that connection. And I met a lot of people, particularly from Thailand and Japan, who actually had been developing this far longer than me, and of course met up with people like Thich Nhat Hanh and others who had really been developing this approach, and really felt like there were a lot of people who I met, particularly in Thailand, who were really had a lot to teach me, and actually we started connections which have lasted to this day. So there started to be a critical mass, and very important for moving this along was working with Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and some of you know, I'm sure, the program that we call the BASE program, the Buddhist Alliance for Social Engagement, which Diana Winston founded in 1995. And how many people, I know Paul has been part of, how many people have been part of the BASE program? Yeah, okay, so Paul, a few people. And so that was a training program that we had to connect basically inner and outer work. Then we've had about 30 of those training programs since 1995 that are basically 6-month programs where people meet typically once a week and start off with a weekend retreat and end with a weekend retreat, and in between typically have a day, a month, and then a weekly meeting to really look at what that means. And everyone in the program is typically involved in some kind of engaged practice. And so we create those programs to support that inner and outer action. And as that program continued, and probably starting about 8 years ago, Diana Winston and I began to teach more classes and retreats on this subject that was really trying to synthesize this and develop a kind of a framework for connecting inner and outer. And the result of a lot of those years of both the BASE program and starting to teach retreats, the crystallization of that was this handout which I gave. So all of these years of work resulted in one piece of paper. But actually this is sort of the skeleton. So I'll just have you look at this, and I want to just really briefly talk about this, and I'll go into detail on one of the principles. So what we came to over these years was that we found it very helpful to try to identify a number of guiding principles for connecting inner and outer transformation. And we had different lists, and we kind of ended with 10, and this actually became the structure of the book that I published at the end of last year, which I brought a few copies here if anyone is interested, called The Engaged Spiritual Life. And it's organized around these principles, and connected with each principles are a number of practices. Now what's important for each of the principles is that as we were articulating them, we came to see that principles like the first one is really about ethics. It's what we call establishing the conditions for safety, with the traditional ethical guidelines, or developing mindfulness in the midst of action and interaction. That what we found was that each of these principles needed to be unpacked in terms of what they meant for individual practice, for what we called relational practice, that is, interacting with others, being in groups, being in a community, being in a relationship, and then lastly, on a collective level. And so as we developed these principles, we found that the underlying principles of inner transformation were actually the same as outer transformation. as more collective work. And I'll go into detail on that in a moment, just to clarify that claim. So we explicated this in terms of these principles, finding that each of them had a meaning for inner practice, and you can see there's a resonance with very traditional Buddhist practice for most of these principles. That is, we start with ethics, we develop mindfulness, we work, the third principle, we work with intention, clarifying motivation, we learn how to open in a balanced way to pain and suffering, and that engenders compassion. The fifth is a principle that's a little bit more oriented towards connecting an inner. It's about the balance when we're working for others of how do we take care of ourselves, which is a core interest for anyone doing long-term work in service or social action. How do I stay balanced myself? The sixth principle we called not knowing but keeping going, which is about that quality of sometimes not knowing where we're going, but really keeping on with that commitment to open, to develop compassion. And also, under that principle, we also look at attachment to views, which comes up not just occasionally, but all the time when we're doing social service or social action. Also comes up individually, but it's a big one if you're doing social service. How do you relate to ideological views, and how do we somehow use them where they're useful, but look out for the attachments. The seventh had to do with interbeing and interdependence. And similarly, a core issue that we looked at there was how to relate to so-called opponents or enemies. Do we demonize enemies? Do we see ourselves as totally other? Or do we develop some way of having a very different view of who our opponents are than is traditional, let's say, on the left? The eighth has to do with working with anger, which is a key energy that comes up when we look at oppression or look at suffering. The ninth had to do with developing more equanimity. And the fourth is a paradoxical principle that we call committed action, non-attachment to outcome. That is the quality of keeping on being committed to our core intention of transformation, and not being knocked around by whether or not we get the results we want. It's a huge one. It's a huge area. And so I thought I would unpack just one of these to give the flavor of this connection in inner and outer. And the rest of these, there are about 20 or 30 pages on each of them in the book I wrote, if you're interested. But I wanted to talk about the fourth because I think it gives one of the clearest ways of understanding this connection of inner and outer transformation. And that's the principle of opening to pain and suffering. And I'll try to make the connection between the individual dimension, the relational dimension or domain, and the collective domain, because I think we can really start to see how our Dharma practice can be extended outward, which is really what we're talking about. Here, we primarily learn how to do the inner work and to see the meaning of Dharma practice in our individual practice. And we try as best we can to bring it out into the world. And I think what we're really lacking are systematic understandings and ways of bringing it outward. That's really why I wrote that book. And so if we look at the principle of opening to pain and suffering, we can see, I think, that connection pretty easily. So when we look to the individual level, we can see that a large part of our practice is learning to be present with what's difficult, without the usual reactivity as much as possible. That we learn how, when we start off initially sitting, we learn how to be with a knee pain that's not causing damage, and we watch initially how our mind says, no, this is not what I signed up for. I signed up for bliss. Knee pain, go away. And when we sit for a while, we can see deeply the conditioning involved just in being with a knee pain, let alone grief or sadness or despair or something difficult. And I think most of us probably know the deep power of this practice to let us work with the unpleasant in different ways. There's a beautiful teaching which I think actually helps make the bridge between the inner and the outer. And that is the teaching, it's one of my favorite ones from the Buddha, called the teaching of the two arrows. And I think many of you know this teaching. It's a powerful one. The Buddha says that we're all as if shot by an arrow, which we could call the arrow of pain. We all have a certain amount of pain in our lives. Some have more pain than others. and so forth. But we all have a certain amount of pain. We have bodies that are susceptible to injury, to illness, and of course to death. And there's a certain amount of pain there. That we have a certain amount of pain because we have at times difficult relationships in which we feel grief or anger or despair or loss. And this is part of the human condition. And we also sometimes in more social settings are treated unfairly or unjustly. And this, in a sense, is a given of human experience. Not that we don't try to transform things, but it's a given that there's pain. And Buddha calls that the first arrow. He says we're all as if shot by the first arrow. He says that the aim of spiritual practice is not to get rid of the first arrow. That's pretty big. It's not to get rid of the first arrow. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't respond to the pain. But he says our aim of our practice is not to get rid of pain, just to have this pain-filled, or have a life that has no pain and is just filled with the pleasant. That is not the aim of practice. And one of the stories that I really love, having survived the generations in the discourses of the Buddha, is the fact that the Buddha in his later age had a bad back. To me that's wonderful. That's there because we don't. In other words, the Buddha is a real human being. He's not mythologized. He had pain in his life. And there in the discourses, you sometimes find him saying, "Ananda, my back's killing me tonight. Can you give the Dharma talk?" And that's real. That's right there. And what it means is that when the Buddha talks about transforming suffering, he's not talking about getting rid of pain. He still has the bad back. He still has, and in other traditions, I think of other traditions where supposedly realized teacher. I think of, some of you know the Tibetan story of Marpa, the teacher of Milarepa. And Milarepa asked Marpa, who was crying and sobbing when his son died. And he said, "What is that about?" He said, when there is loss, there is sadness. And he added Dharma points about not being attached in certain ways, but he was saying, let it flow when it's there. And so the aim of this practice is not to get rid of the pain, but the Buddha said the aim of practice is not to shoot a second arrow because of the first arrow. And we can understand that in different ways. He said the practitioner learns how not to shoot a second arrow, meaning not to cause further pain because of the pain that arises. And we can ask, what does it mean to shoot the second arrow? It can mean on the level of physical pain to tense around the pain. When we have physical pain and we tense, and I've heard doctors say that 80% of what patients experience as pain is not the original stimulus, but it's the reaction to the stimulus. And so this is why meditation is having such a profound impact on medical practice, because it can teach people how to not shoot the second arrow, basically, how to not continue with that 80%. We also shoot the second arrow when I'm discussing something at work and someone says something really kind of nasty and insensitive to me, and I snap back with something nasty and insensitive. That's the second arrow. Or it's the second arrow when I'm feeling really sad and I act out in certain ways, or I blame myself. I did something that I didn't feel good about, I start blaming myself. That's the second arrow. And it's also the second arrow when something bad happens to me and I take it out on someone else. And actually we know that a lot of violence in society is basically people who are very much in pain taking it out on others. There was a television program that Bill Moyers did talking with teenage murderers. And most of them said, I was really hurting and that person was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there's a way that the second arrow is continually being shot. And so the aim of practice is to learn how to be with what's difficult and to respond wisely, but to be really careful about that reactivity that comes from the presence of the unpleasant. And so that teaching is very clear on an individual level, and to me it also starts to give a model for how to work relationally and collectively. That when we look to relationships, we find in workplaces or in many relationships, it's very hard to be with what's painful. In how many workplaces that you've been in have elephants in the middle of the room, which are basically pain that no one wants to deal with. You have feuds between two people at work where they don't have the means to deal with it, and it stays in the middle of the room and dominates things for 30 years, right? Or some of our own relationships, because we don't have very good tools for being with what's painful and working with it on an interpersonal level. And interestingly, I believe that that same principle of the two arrows is the basis for the nonviolence of Gandhi and King. Think of their approach. What is it if not saying, there has been pain done to me. I have been oppressed. For Gandhi by the British, the colonialists. By King responding to the racism, particularly of the South. And they're both saying, basically, there's been violence. I will not continue the cycles of violence by being violent myself. And yet I will very adamantly respond to oppression. So it's not passivity at all. And yet it's saying the problem is to find a way not to shoot the second arrow in the sphere of social change. And they're basically saying, I want to respond in a powerful way, but not to respond out of reactivity, but actually, both of them would say, to respond out of love, which is extremely challenging to do. But this is a way of understanding a basis for social change and social transformation. I think you can begin to see how the inner work we do and our relational work and our work in the larger society can be seen as more and more of a seamless whole. That and in fact, they can inform each other. That as I do the work individually in meditation, I learn about shooting the second arrow. And I start to understand the principles better. And as I do that, I can be much more skillful in working interpersonally or being part of a social movement. And so I think you can get that sense of how we have the tools for individual practice, and yet we don't really know so well how to bring those very principles and practices out into our relational fields, out into our workplaces. How do we work with pain and conflict in a workplace? I don't think we have as good tools as we do in the meditation. And so, to me, part of the creativity that's demanded of us, if we're interested in making those connections between inner and outer transformation, is to really give energy and be creative about how to make that work interpersonally, in communities, in workplaces, and then to help bring that further out into social action and social movements. So I think I'll close just by reading some passages from people who have inspired me about making that inner and outer connection. We can have some time talking together. This is from Thich Nhat Hanh. When I was in Vietnam, many of our villages were being bombed. Along with my monastic brothers and sisters, I had to decide what to do. Should we continue to practice in our monasteries, or should we leave the meditation halls in order to help the people who were suffering under the bombs? After careful reflection, we decided to do both. To go out and help people, and to do so in mindfulness. We called it engaged Buddhism. Mindfulness must be engaged. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. We must be aware of the real problems of the world. Then with mindfulness, we will know what to do and what not to do to be of help. And then I want to close with something from Joanna Macy, who talks about this same approach. She calls it the third turning of the wheel. The first turning of the wheel was the Buddha's first sermon. Sometimes Mahayana is said to be the second turning of the wheel. And she says the third turning of her wheel is happening now, and it's this connection of inner and outer work. This third turning of the wheel is evident in many ways. I see it in the return of the social teachings of the Buddha, in the revitalization of the Bodhisattva ideal and the rapid spread of engaged Buddhism, be it in Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka, Ambedkar in India, or Dharma activists in Tibet, Thailand, Southeast Asia. Western Buddhists, too, are taking Dharma practice out into the world, developing skillful means for embodying compassion as they act to serve the homeless, to restore creek beds or block weapons shipments. The vitality of Buddhism today is most clearly reflected in the way it is being brought to bear on social, economic, political, and environmental issues. The gate of the Dharma does not close behind us to secure us in a cloistered existence, away from the turbulence and suffering, so much as it leads us out into a life of risk for the sake of all beings. As many Dharma brothers and sisters discover today, the world is our cloister. Or maybe I'll say one. I'll just have one more quotation which extends that, which is from a Japanese Zen teacher named Odo Sessho. He says, "In Zen, there are only two things: you sit and you sweep the garden. It doesn't matter how big the garden is. You sit and you sweep the garden. It doesn't matter how big the garden is." So may our garden continually get bigger. Thank you.
Recently, I've been active in the last peace march we had.
Yeah.
Planning for that. And we had a wonderful, people got to the Flores Park. We had a wonderful display of a Buddhist Peace Fellowship meditation center, lots of cushions. The boots being displayed below, but the boots of those men and women who were killed in the war. They have the Friends Service Committee does that. But more importantly, the nonviolent peace organizations, best way to put it, Friends of this, I think we had a ameliorative effect as an answer on the group that plans it. Remember, some of those, a lot of anger, a lot of comes out. It was reduced a lot through playing with them instead of walking away, which was my first intention. I'm not going near it. I don't like what they do. It's not my people. I didn't do much with them, but I do know that people stay. Yes, we have to work with answer. It's doing a good job. It had a ameliorative effect. The last parade we had was really nice with the additional meditative thing.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I was actually teaching a retreat. I was more of the inner transformation.
God bless, we had a great day on Saturday.
It was Ed?
What?
Was your name?
My name is Don.
Don.
I don't know her now.
Okay. Thank you, Don. Yeah. It's I think things are developing, and there's a whole. I think there are many ways in which that will continue to evolve, and I would also. I think in the long run, if demonstrations can not just be about the negative, but also point towards the positive, in a way, if they can incorporate more of those three dimensions of the turning that Joanna Macy talked about. So it's not just, we don't want this, but actually, I think if I remember, some of the earlier demonstrations, like February 15th, 2003, it had more qualities of celebration in it, and really pointing towards what we want. So I think there's a lot of beautiful work to be done to make, to really integrate that and have new approaches. So thank you, Don. Please, yeah.
You talked about alternative institutions.
Yeah.
But I would also suggest that it's very valuable to work with the institutions that actually have power.
Oh, yeah.
On the highest level, Donald Chase talks about in the extreme poverty in the world. It's amazing that we can do this in our lifetime.
Yeah.
But you're only going to do this with big institutions like the United Nations and the U.S. government. But if you work with institutions on a local level that do have power on a local level, even if this is as local as your precinct, you're going to be working with people who have different beliefs and different agendas from you, but basically are of goodwill. And you'll see how hard it is, even on a very local level, with very few people, to do this. And it can give you a compassion in your heart for the people on a state and a national, on a global level, for how difficult it is for them to make the changes that we would like to see as well.
Yeah. So thank you for that correction, as it were, because I certainly would, as it were, complement the work of developing so-called alternative institutions with, as it were, developing those alternatives within the institutions, the mainstream institutions themselves. And some people choose to be there, and some find it's too hard in a particular instance. So thank you. I think you had your hand up initially, I remember.
Maybe you can help me ask the question first. There's this. I'm trying to kind of work out the relationship between self-preservation and compassion, and how because I find they're often in conflict in my own life. So, for example, I see that I'm dependent on a very complex medical infrastructure. I'm dependent on post-industrial all of this stuff for my survival, and yet I see essentially fundamentally how it's unsustainable. So for me to work towards something that is more sustainable, essentially I'm working in a way against my own survival. So that's sometimes that's maybe not a right way of framing it, but that's how it feels sometimes. It feels that I have to work against my own individual sense of...
Can you say a little bit more? So you're saying that if you see how the system is unsustainable and yet it's meeting some of your needs?
Some of my basic needs, and I don't see how it could aggregate those needs met any other way. I just can't imagine it. So maybe it's possible, but it doesn't seem likely. So for me, I'm saying that a lot of times I'll defer to self-preservation over compassion in that instance, not necessarily because I want to, but because that's my impulse. And I'm wondering how that plays. How do you kind of describe that experience in your own case and work with that?
It's a challenging one. I imagine that if everyone, your name is?
Mark,
if every people get the gist of what Mark was saying, that, it's probably most of our institutions, certainly many of them, are not sustainable. Certainly ecologically, and the connection of our economy to the ecological issues makes it clear that we can't go around driving cars as we do and so forth. And yet, on a given day, if I have to go somewhere, I drive a car, even though I know that it's in the long term unsustainable. I don't think it has to be framed as an either or. I think typically, and this is really, maybe this is where we can have recourse to the Buddha, because do you remember the middle way in Buddhism? And if you actually study that, it often comes down to people thinking that there are only these two extreme choices. And the Buddha was saying when you actually go into the experience, it opens up a sort of middle territory. And I think that's also a lot of the basis for conflict resolution. In a lot of the most violent places in the world, it seems like only the extremes have power, the Middle East being an example. And so the work to be done is really to find a middle way. I think it's the case in the Middle East, and it's the case in these sort of situations. Can we find a way that addresses the sustainability issues, but also meets needs? And I think a lot of people, I think that's partly behind your question, really, that you can take some of the mainstream institutions and find ways to shift them in major ways. But that so it doesn't become an either or like that. So I think I would look to that kind of thinking and see if they're sort of a middle way alternative, and kind of see if you can look at that thinking in that way. Please.
So to move it down to the individual level, and perhaps an example of that, but only on what is commonly known as the self. I had a hip replacement about a year and a half ago, and so one of the things that came up with that is that I had some pain. And occasionally it would be reasonably severe. And so what I discovered I could do would be I would get up, and it occurred during the night, I would get up and pick up Stephen Levine's text. I believe it was Who Dies, in which he has a number of pain meditations, pain meditations. And his general argument is that the way we typically approach pain is aversion. We try to get rid of it, and it doesn't work very well. And what he suggests instead is exploration of every detail of this demon, rather like the Buddha with the demons. And so I thought, all right, I'll try it. So I tried it, and I discovered when I would do that with the guided meditation, I could look at what is its shape, what is its texture, is it constant, is it fluctuating, where is it moving to? And after a while, if I had a strong enough incentive, that is enough pain, it would disappear. And I actually a couple of times had pretty much as close to a mystical experience of the nature of existence as I ever have. So this was another on a personal level of a middle way or a different way.
Different way, And remind me of your name?
Lee Robbins.
Lee, thank you, Lee. It's I imagine that many people here can relate to that. That it's really and it's something that we can discover or have discovered in retreats, where we really are invited sometimes to explore the nature of pain. And for many of us, it is to discover that tremendous amount of pain is the second arrow that is created, and also as we go deeper into it, we discover that sometimes it does just shift or go away. And also when there's a deep level of concentration, sometimes it stops being pain and starts being just very strong sensation.
Yes, that is what. Which
is very amazing, that with a concentrated mind, pleasure and pain meet in a way, and pain actually turns into pleasure. It's interesting. And I know, just to kind of fill out one piece there, Stephen Levine, while he recommended pain meditation, he recommended at certain times when the pain is very intense, not just pain meditation, but pain medication. So he wasn't saying don't use medication, but it's really the question is when there's some degree of balance in the mind, then that kind of investigation of pain can be incredibly revealing. And I imagine this resonates with most people here, that in my early days of meditation, it was revelatory to see how conditioned I was to avoid pain and what I would do to avoid it, and how, bodily, emotional, and so forth. It was very powerful to see. And maybe just one last piece is that that distinction between the first and the second arrow, to me, is the main way to make sense of the Buddha's first noble truth, the truth of suffering, or dukkha. That dukkha is not about getting rid of pain, but it's about suffering, which we can translate more as reactivity to whatever is present, or resistance to what is present. That's what I think the Buddha is meaning by suffering. Not simply the fact of the unpleasant, because when the Buddha talks about transforming and overcoming suffering, he's not talking about getting rid of all pain. That doesn't make sense. But he is talking about, so he presumably he could have a backache, and have a bad back and have pain there, but presumably he wasn't adding that 80% to the back pain. And that's I think what's meant by transforming suffering. It's not meaning that we get rid of the pain. And that's an important issue, because I think that's often not quite understood. Please.
Excuse me, Don. In the interest of time, I think we'll need to conclude, but you'll be available after the meeting to discuss any number of questions with you.
Yeah, I'll be here. And let me just say, I brought in, if anyone is interested, I have my teaching schedule for the near future here, if anyone would be interested. I don't have copies for everyone, but I have about 20 copies here. And I also, if anyone would be interested in being on an email list, and to get emails of mostly of my teaching schedule, which I don't send out very much. It's about 2 or 3 times a year. So will not contribute to the syndrome of email box clutter. And then lastly, if anyone is interested, I did bring some copies of my book here. It has a nice cover. And I think I hope good content, between the cover and the back cover. And if anyone's interested, I'll be here for a while, and I actually will be willing to sign books. So,
Have book brought pen.
Yeah. Have book brought pen, and not too soon for the holiday season. My friends are encouraging me to be more entrepreneurial. I did it. So thank you. And I will be here to talk further.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's see. Any announcements? Brief announcements, John?
I intended to make this announcement before you talked. And I say that because there is now a San Francisco chapter of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. That chapter of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship is an organization that does things that exemplify what the Buddhist Peace Fellowship stands for. Because it doesn't actually get down into communities and do things. It's one organization for a country. So we have this chapter going. We've done some interesting things recently about more, Iraq situation and about Burmese situation during demonstrations. So if you just like to be on our mailing list, you don't have to commit to anything. If you'd like to be on our mailing list and know about our programs, or if you'd really like to help us out a lot, it would be good because we're beleaguered 6 or 7 people right now. Anyway, please let me know, and we'll get your name on the mailing list. Thanks, Don.
Thank
Because
you.
it really is about engaged.
It is, and it's a very sweet organization.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Back there?
Yeah, very much in keeping with the topic today, at Spirit Rock on November 17th, there'll be a day-long program called the Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream Symposium. Mm-hmm. And Jack Cornfield and Wes Nisker will be presenting, and I'll be doing part of it too. It's basically to bring forth an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, and socially just human presence on the planet. And it's about facing up to the unconscious assumptions of our culture and what we can do about them to change the dream of the modern world.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it'll be combining Buddhist stuff with, it was developed by the Pachamama Alliance, and so combining Buddhist stuff with indigenous wisdom as well.
And the date of that event again?
November 17th, Saturday. It's a fundraiser for Spirit Rock.
I brought a few of the Spirit Rock newsletters if anyone wants that. Has that information in there?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a meditation group that meets at my house near Fulton and Divisadero on Tuesday nights from 7:30 to 8:30. So if anyone's interested, just let me know.
There's also a sitting group on Monday nights at the Gay Center from 5:30 to 6:30. Same format as here, a half hour sit, and there's only a half hour for a Dharma talk or discussion. So that's every Monday at the Gay Center from 5:30 to 6:30. It's a mixed group, LGBT and whole gamut.
Next Sunday on November 11th, James Barras will be speaking on Awakening Joy, and he is a founding teacher at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. He's also on the board of the advisory board on the International Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I need some meditation.
Anyway, speaking here. I'm the host today. There's a variety of unhealthy pastries I brought, so enjoy. And please, if you're going to have tea, wash out your cup afterwards and put it on the little rack to dry. There's a Dana bowl, so if you'd like to give a donation, suggested from $5 to $8, please give what you can. And afterwards, there's a group of people that goes out to lunch, and they'll all gather by the front door around 12:30, I believe.
Yes, there will be an annual Thanksgiving Day potluck for GBF at my place, and the event will start at 4 p.m. It's the GBF's attempt to create an alternative form of family celebration, and everybody is welcome. And this particular potluck will be a little more structured than the usual potluck, so that we can have the necessary items on the table for Thanksgiving. So if you're interested in coming, please give me a call or talk to me later. Thank you.
He does a fabulous job of getting
That's great. Our own experience of engaged Buddhism in GBF is twice a month. We do dinners for the Lark Street Youth Center. Bill heads one dinner, and I had the other dinner. So if you're interested, I don't speak for myself. I don't know what a building volunteers are, but if you're interested in being included in a list of volunteers, and it's not a hard and fast commitment, it's just being put on a list, you can approach me afterwards.
What day of the week?
I do it on the third Saturday of the month, and Bill does it on the fourth Saturday of the month.
Anyone else? Okay, let's gather in a circle for our dedication.
So feeling our presence here in this room. And knowing that we practice not just for ourselves but for others. May we offer the fruits of our practice, our being together, our good hearts, our energy outward for the benefit of all beings, for their healing, their transformation, and their freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.